Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, co-president of ColumbiaDC and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, let me thank our partners, Brown Club of Washington, D.C., and the members for being with us and joining us this evening. Very privileged and honored to have Amra Sabic-El-Rayess, Associate Professor of Practice at Teachers College, Columbia University, to talk to us about pseudospeciation and how we can use education to fight back. And this would be in conversation with our host, Emily Dietsch. Amra grew up in Bihać, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and after surviving ethnic cleansing and more than 1,100 days under the Serbs' military siege, she emigrated to the United States in '96. By December '99, she earned a BA in economics from Brown University, and later she obtained 2 masters and a doctorate from Columbia University. Currently, she is a professor at Columbia's Teachers College, working on understanding how and why societies fall apart and what role education can play in rebuilding decimated countries. She has published on education-related issues and has lectured around the world to adult and adolescent audiences. Our host this evening, Emily Dietsch, is an academic consultant based in Washington, D.C. She has studied the history of art and architecture and American studies at Brown University before pursuing doctoral work in the same fields at GW. In particular, her scholarship focuses on matters of identity and social movements that the Cold War ushered into being, particularly among marginalized populations. She serves as the co-president for the Brown Club of DC, as managing director for the Atlantic Black Box Project, and also she is on the steering committee of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Amra, Emily, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for that, Kambiz, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. Want to do a brief bit of framing work in terms of how the conversation will run and how you all can engage with us. So we're going to do some context setting at the very beginning because this is such a wide-ranging conversation. So Amra will share a bit and we will talk. While we are doing that, please go to the Q&A box. There, not the chat section, but the Q&A box, and share any thoughts or questions because we will introduce those towards the end of the conversation, and we really want to hear from you and answer to those thoughts and questions that you have. So Amra, I think you're going to kick us off with a little bit of a reading from your personal experience and your memoir, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much, Emily. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for being here tonight with us. Thank you, Kambiz, for your invitation that I join you this evening. And I am grateful to both you and Emily for your kind words. It is a distinct honor to have been invited to speak with you on the topic of extreme narratives, othering, marginalization, and most importantly, on how educators can help address this challenge within our classrooms, schools, and communities. We are at a tipping point in our country's history when we need to actively counter both racism and radicalization to preserve our democracy. Educators are our democracy's first responders. My own work as an educator, author, and a Bosnian genocide survivor has centered on building our collective resilience to hate narratives that can normalize even the extreme forms of direct violence like genocide. In the lecture portion of this evening, I will share with you some insights from my research on radicalization, but I will do so by telling you a story of how right-wing extremism changed my own life and today inspires my scholarship. I will then read a segment from my award-winning memoir titled The Cat I Never Named, The True Story of Love, War, and Survival, published worldwide by Bloomsbury in the fall of 2020. As we begin, I will take you back with me to some of the most difficult moments in my life. They remain vivid in my memory and they inspire my scholarly commitment to the study of radicalization, social transformation, and hate. Though I have spoken on the subject of extremism, radicalization, hate, targeted violence, and othering in about 30 countries over the last year, I have to admit that these conversations are never easy for me. As anyone who has lived through trauma knows, we tend to internalize tragic experiences rather than place them on a public display. But I am committed, both professionally and personally, to working on these challenging topics for the following 3 reasons. First, I feel responsibility to do this work for my friends, classmates, and relatives who have been raped, killed, and tortured simply for who they are. They will never have their chance to speak before an audience like this. Second, a Bosnian story of ethnic persecution of a young Muslim woman may seem distant and perhaps not relatable to many of you, but the violence and exclusion we're witnessing today in the United States mirror my own story. Whether one is targeted because of the color of their skin, because of the God they choose to pray to, because of who they want to love, because of their ethnic origin, their immigrant background, their poverty, their physical disability or mental illness, their exclusion echoes my own. And the third reason why I stand before you is that my scholarship evinces that the power to alter and interrupt the paths to radicalization, othering, and dehumanization is in the hands of educators. We are the ones who can bring our communities closer together and compel our new generations to collective action. I will begin by sharing a bit of background on the Bosnian genocide, especially for those of you not familiar with the reasons behind that genocide or its links to the far-right extremism in the United States today. I grew up in a small but diverse town of Bihać in the former Yugoslavia in the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. At the time, Yugoslavia consisted of 6 republics and 2 autonomous regions. But the Republic of Serbia was really the dominant player and in control of the nation's politics, economy, and military. As communism came to an end in the early 1990s, this cobbled together nation of Yugoslavia started to fall apart. And individual republics sought their independence. Instead of independence and equal rights for all, Serbia wanted to turn Yugoslavia into an ethnically cleansed and imagined nation called Greater Serbia. This led to multiple wars. First, Serbia attacked Slovenia, then occupied a portion of Croatia bordering Bosnia near my hometown. Like the United States, Bosnia was ethnically diverse, more diverse than any other republic in the former Yugoslavia. So once Serbia attacked Bosnia and received support from the local Bosnian Serbs, the bloodshed was particularly gruesome. Bosnian Muslims stood in the way of ethnically clean Greater Serbia. So one of Serbia's key military and political goals became the brutal eradication of Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims. I was one of those Muslims. I remember growing up in the former Yugoslavia as a young girl, feeling marginalized in our educational system. I fantasized about encountering Amra as the main character in one of my school readings, perhaps depicted as an excellent student or a funny girl or a good friend. But Muslim girls with names like Amra were invisible to our educational system. We were not present in our school readings. We only lived in the popular culture, in jokes that ridiculed Bosnian Muslims as stupid and worthless. I knew I was being educated into seeing myself as a lesser. I was a young girl then, and I desperately wanted to belong and experience respect in my own community. I thought the only way to unother myself was to distance myself from my Muslim identity. I never once prayed. I never talked about being Muslim. I stayed away from Islam as if it were a plague. Instead, I focused on winning every academic competition I could win and studied until I would master each subject to perfection to show I was worthy of acceptance, recognition, and respect. Education was my savior and my only outlet for action. But none of my efforts produced a sense of belonging. I was, what I call in my scholarly work today, educationally displaced from the class conversations, literature, and activities, despite my academic achievements. I was voiceless and invisible in the books I read, and often targeted by some of my Serb teachers. This exclusion was neither incidental nor accidental. The educational system in the former Yugoslavia was designed to transpose Bosnian Muslims, their lived experiences and representations from the mainstream curriculum in schools. The goal was to engender a feeling of a lesser contribution, meaning, and value to society relative to the holders of the privileged Serb identity. Neither my silence nor my hard work changed how that world saw me. By the late 1980s, Serbia had a rising demagogue, Slobodan Milosevic, a political leader who took the control over the military, politics, and media in the former Yugoslavia as he engaged in fear-mongering. What I had experienced in the classroom was now magnified in all spheres of life. Milosevic started to propagate the victimhood narrative, claiming Serbs were under the threat of the rising diversity, urging them to prepare to take up weapons and transform former Yugoslavia into Greater Serbia, a country for Serbs only. He likened Serbs to the protectors of the ethnic purity and whiteness in Christian Europe. Milosevic and Serb nationalists' agenda mirrored that of white supremacists today. For them, Bosnian Muslims embodied a form of ethnic and racial impurity warranting their decimation. Before too long, the media was producing untrue stories of Bosnian Muslims throwing Serb babies to animals in the Sarajevo Zoo, sounding eerily similar to some of the current QAnon falsehoods. By June of 1992, the mass radicalization of ordinary Serbs was achieved. Nearly all my Serb friends and teachers left my city of Bihać literally overnight after being secretly warned by the Serb forces that the military would besiege the city and begin to execute those of us who remained, Bosnian Muslims and Catholics. Serb artillery was placed on the hills around Bihać, and we no longer had access to food, electricity, phones, or the outside world. The Serb forces got to frame the Bosnia's narrative to the world. They were bombing and killing us daily under the military siege that lasted for nearly 1,200 days, longer than the infamous siege of Leningrad in World War II. Death defined the next 4 years of my life and that of most Bosnian Muslims. During those years, every day, someone I loved, I played with, or I knew died. It felt as if I stood in a quickly moving line for execution, waiting for my turn. And it was only a question of how and when I would die. I was certain that survival was not in my cards. I will share one particular moment with you that I think carries an important lesson for all of us in this virtual room tonight. We were often running out of food, and at one time, my mother wanted to use our last money to cross the enemy line, where we knew others have gone to trade with the Serb soldiers. We could not afford prices in the black market, but that time in the war, my mom was already deaf from a bomb that hit our home. So I insisted on going with her. The two of us had hoped to buy cooking oil, flour, or salt. One day, we crossed into the no man's land between the Serb and Bosnian soldiers. We knew some of those who dared to walk through that area before us had lost their limbs because of mines. For Serb soldiers, we were just vermin, free for them to shoot at or capture, theirs to use. But when they could make money off of our desperation, they did not mind. When my mom and I got to them, they laughed at us and our audacity to stand in front of their bunkers and artillery. We asked if they had any food they could sell to us. Within minutes, one of the drunken soldiers grabbed me and my mother struggled to pull me away. A Muslim soldier fired a shot to help us escape. Shooting ensued, and before too long, my mother and I were back to running and crawling through the minefield. I didn't even think about being blown up. Anything was better than being raped by those leering, cruel men. I cried on our way back home, realizing that my life was miserable. I was disgusted at life, at us, at our desperation, at the world, at everything around us. All of humanity was infected with hate. And all this was happening to me simply because I'm a Muslim. For that, I was marked. I share this story not to have you feel sorry for what I had lived through, but in hope that it will compel you to do what you can to counter this kind of hate and racism. In October of 2020, I wrote an essay for Al Jazeera on the parallels between Islamophobia in the Balkans and the growing threat of white supremacy in the United States. I warned of the mass radicalization that could escalate into the type of violence that shook America on January 6th. Today, American white supremacists flock to the Serb nationalist narrative premised on a long-held fear of Muslims. Bosnia is now de facto ethnically segregated, serving as an inspiration for the far-right groups in the US that extreme violence can be a pathway to ethnic and racial purity. Religion in particular has historically drawn empires into wars, making Islam a potent trigger in the recruitment efforts by the white supremacists. White supremacy needs an anchor in the past, and the Crusades served that purpose with their imagery of bloodshed encoded into Western memory. Through Islamophobia, white supremacists evoke a fear that power and land could be lost to Muslims, Muslims like me, who they see as coming for them and their culture now. This very view of Muslims as invaders has been normalized in the US politics today. Former US President Donald Trump has consistently depicted Muslims as an existential threat. Stephen Miller, one of Trump's ideological underlings, equates Islam with fascism, calling it Islamofascism. Research by Megan Squire at Ellen University showed that over 700,000 members of nearly 2,000 Facebook groups associated with 10 different far-right ideologies used anti-Muslim bias as the ideological center for recruitment and radicalization. The majority of Americans already believe that most Americans are prejudiced toward Muslim Americans. In a study I conducted this year with my graduate students at Columbia University's Teachers College and funded by the Department of Homeland Security's Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, we have surveyed US educators and found that 68% of participating educators hear or see anti-Muslim bias occurring at their schools by their students, while 92% of US educators hear or see anti-Muslim bias occurring at their schools by their colleagues. This brings me to the key question that many of you might have on your mind. How can we prevent, interrupt, or reverse this mass and domestic radicalization? We first need to train educators on how to recognize their own implicit biases and ensure that American kids today are not educationally displaced for who they are. Educators have the power to shift perceptions, views, beliefs, and norms in the American society. I do it every day in my classroom at Columbia, but we need to see that change in every classroom in America. By preventing different forms of racism, including anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-Muslim racism, and other forms of exclusion, we can disarm the far-right groups from using fear of others in their recruitment. Educators should not only provide counter-narratives to hate, but we ought to build moral resilience to hate, so when individuals meet hate-filled narratives online, they can critically think, self-reflect, and say no to extremism. Visually, envision violence as a tree. At its roots is what Galtung first termed cultural violence. Cultural violence is defined as the stories and images that groups produce to propagate hate, exclusion, superiority, and glorification of one race, religion, or ethnicity over others. Islamophobic narratives that led to the genocide in Bosnia are a quintessential example of cultural violence. Propagation of racial stereotypes in the US or centering the importance of one group over others in our culture, history, science, or math lessons is a form of cultural violence. Now, please consider structural and direct violence, whether manifest in police brutality and killing of innocent Black people or in excessive disciplining of minority students, as other forms of violence that could be prevented if we effectively counter the cultural violence. We watch and listen to stories that other and dehumanize via traditional media, social media, in workplace, at home, and in schools. And it is these narratives in our society that shift perspectives and transform ordinary people into radicalized actors who begin to morally justify killing. whether it is a killing of an innocent Black teen on an American street or a Muslim child in a foreign land. In my research on how groups radicalize, I have learned that radicalization is not the destination, but the process that does not begin when a young individual enters the radicalizing space online. It begins when a young person starts feeling educationally displaced in the classroom. When young people have grievances or challenges, whether it's a parent losing a job, dealing with a mental health issue, having disagreement with our country's foreign policy, or feeling excluded by their peers, there's a chance that those grievances could lead to radicalization if we fail to address them. Together with my graduate students last semester, we have created a professional training opportunity for educators that aims to counter extremism and intolerance in schools. Our research found that 77% of participating educators never engaged in a professional training initiative aimed at addressing anti-Muslim bias. To prevent extremism in our schools, educators need to be given not only professional training opportunities, but space, support, and time to incorporate diverse narratives and viewpoints and engage in the messy work of negotiating conflict and compromises in the classroom. We need to shift from cultures of silence and discipline to cultures of inquiry and critical thinking. To do this effectively, we need curricula filled with stories inspiring critical thinking, collective empathy, and resilience to counter the narratives of demonization, victimization, and supremacy. This is one of the reasons why I wrote The Cat I Never Named, as a young adult story of moral resilience to hate, offering educators a platform to use in their teaching to help include, engage, and empower. Now I would like to end my lecture portion of the evening by reading a segment from my memoir, The Cat I Never Named, a true story of love, war, and survival. This particular section depicts one of many moments that changed me forever during that period in my life. Then I hear a whistling overhead, a thin, reedy sound. An instant later, I see a flash as a missile hits a house on the bank of the Una, on my home side of the bridge. The sound of the explosion comes in an instant later, and I stand frozen, bizarrely thinking about physics, about the relative speed of light and sound that cleaves the experience in two. First, the sight of fire and flame, then disconnected by a second or two, sound waves that roll over me like messengers eager to bear bad news. I hear another missile overhead, launched from the mountains surrounding our town. Someone told Tata, who told me in turn, the bomb that you hear is not the one with your name on it. If you hear it whistle, it's because it's flying over your head to somewhere else. You never hear a whisper from the bomb that kills you. The air raid siren starts its high-pitched howl, then we have no radar, nothing to tell us that the missiles are inbound, so the siren is a joke. It serves to remind us that people are being killed. It gives no warning, just wails and mourns with the rest of us. Davor and I find each other again. We're still frozen in place, not knowing if we're about to die, but our eyes meet across the bridge. Between us, I see the mother and her little boy, the girl in the green sweater, a trio of middle-aged women who look like sisters. Davor takes a step toward me. Then the air seems to be sucked out of the world as I'm hit with an earth-shattering, deafening explosion. There's a flash between Davor and me, and I'm blinded. Metal and stone are flying around me. I turn to run, and it's only when my legs are moving that I realize I'm not dead. I only make it a few steps before I fall, scraping my knees in the dust and chaos. I hear screams and I drag myself to my feet, stunned. My ears are ringing and the air is choked with dust. I smell smoke. I taste smoke. There's grit on my tongue. The blue bridge is still standing. The bomb struck a glancing blow that didn't do anything much to the structure, but the pedestrians on the bridge. Against every survival instinct, I make myself walk back towards the other end of the bridge. I look all around, but don't see Davor. The little boy, the one who wanted to look at fish over the side of the bridge, is standing in the middle of a cloud of masonry dust. His mouth is open. And at first, I think the sound he's making is part of the loud ringing in my ears because everything sounds weirdly muffled at first. The sounds are returning to my ears one at a time. Then I realize he's screaming a long, drawn out, terrible cry that stops only when he's out of breath, then starts again after a ragged gasp. I go to him. He's blonde, tussle-haired, and blue-eyed, just like Dino when he was younger. But his little face looks impossibly old. I wish he could be confused. I wish he didn't know exactly what just happened. But this little boy understands his loss, and he's suffused with helpless, inarticulate rage. I go to him, reaching out my hand. He just stares at me with his prematurely aged face. I look beyond him. Blood on a stylish suit, the fox fur collar, made from a whole fox. Its sharp white teeth grinning as it grasps its own tail. Its black glass eyes are staring at me. Above that, nothing. There's nothing where his mother's head should be. He finds words now, and his screams turn into a desperate wail for his mother. He's not looking at her, but he must have seen. He's calling to her like his words could turn back time, undo the bomb, like if he begs the universe loudly enough, he can make his mother alive again. I take his little hand, and he looks at me like I'm an alien thing. I try to lead him off the bridge, but he's like a boulder, immovable. All this time, he never stops screaming his feral fury against the world. An old man staggers beside us. A couple clings to each other as they walk through the smoke. Though it's midday, the smoke and dust make it look like a foggy evening. Survivors are like ghosts in the haze. I still don't see Davor. Not among the bodies or the survivors. The little boy's grief shatters me. There is nothing I can do. So I leave him. It's a wrenching decision, but someone will come to help him. I look at the other people on the bridge. The three middle-aged sisters are strewn about like old clothes. That's what I see. Their old lady sweaters and their sensible shoes. A man is hanging half of the bridge draped over the rail. Blood is dripping in a puddle at his feet. Then I see the girl in the green sweater like mine. She's on the ground, curled on her side, facing away from me. Her sweater is perfectly clean and tidy, like she just decided to take a nap in this odd place. I think she's unconscious. Maybe she was knocked out by the shockwave. I kneel at her side and take her shoulder, gently turning her over as I say, "Don't worry, I'm here. I'll help you." I roll her and find the bloody horror. The front of her body is stripped of clothes, stripped of skin, shredded from a hail of metal and stone shrapnel. From the front, she doesn't look human. She looks like meat. I scream and scramble backward on my hands and feet like a crab. Wiping my bloody hands on the ground, they make a red paste with the dust. I roll to my knees, haul myself to my feet, look around for somebody, anybody who can do something. Suddenly, there are lights up ahead in the middle of the road where we're walking. It's a big square white lorry with tall blue letters on the side, UN. The United Nations is supposed to be here to help the suffering, to facilitate peace. With a gasp of relief, I run to meet the truck, waving my hand to stop them. "Help is here," I shout to the little boy as I pass him. "These men will help you." I'm standing in the middle of the road, right in the truck's path. It slows. The driver sees me. He meets my eye. Please have medics, I think. Please have some kind counselor who can take care of this poor child. Please have someone to compassionately tend to that poor girl's body to cover her ravaged face. But the UN truck swerves around me, increasing speed. Okay, I think they're going to the wounded in the center of the bridge. But the truck doesn't stop. It drives fast enough to make the damaged bridge shake. It swerves carefully around the carnage and rubble and carries on as if dead Bosnians weren't sprawled on the streets. The world is watching and it doesn't care. Thank you.
Thank you, I think. Goodness, there's a lot to absorb there. I've read that passage, Amra, in the book, but hearing you read it out loud brings a very emotional dimension to it. I wonder, while I was hearing you read that, if you could speak about how your experience through that led you to education and the concept of pseudospeciation as what you wanted to pursue to counteract what you experienced versus other forms of activism. What was it about education that spoke to you and was the way?
There was a moment during the war when Serb forces were coming closer to my neighborhood in my besieged city, and they were burning down the neighborhoods just across the river. And it was a moment where my father had a very honest conversation with me. I was 16, 17 years old at the time. And he said, Amra, it might be that we're all killed. All of us are killed today. And you might be raped. But if you survive, there's one thing that no soldier can ever take away from you. And that is your education. And that was a turning point for me during the war, where I decided that I would focus not so much on being the center of someone else's hate, but center my energy on what I can do within myself and within my community to make a difference for however long I have left to live. And that was a moment when I started to collect old books from neighbors and relatives and mastered physics and taught myself English. I never was formally trained in English language. I studied Russian at the time or before the war. And I also became a teacher. That was the first time I walked into a classroom. I was one of the top math and physics students in the country. And I was asked to replace teachers who were killed or injured and not teaching. And I became a role model for fifth graders and sixth graders and high school students who were in some cases only a year younger than me, who were looking up to me to inspire them. And that was a very empowering feeling. And I realized how much of my own activism during the war was not only self-empowering, but empowering for those that I impacted. Some of my students from those days are today in the United States and have their PhDs and they're successful. And I say with a great deal of pride that I have been a teacher for now 27 years. And I started as a high school, really as a high school student, as a high school graduate.
Thank you for your service, Amra. I will take a quick pause to remind everyone who's here. We do want to hear your comments and questions, so please do go to the Q&A box, and Amra and I will address those at the end. So I think my follow-up to that story, Amra, is there's something both timeless and timely about what you are sharing, in that it resonates in the current moment in terms of information being or misinformation being a catalyst for ugly currents across the globe and at home in the US. And then timeless in that, you know, as a historian looking across most of American history, education has been put up as the self. It's in the foundational documents of America. It's routinely brought up as something for immigrants, for various oppressed communities to uplift themselves, etc. So if education is the self, why is it so hard to accomplish? Why do we never quite get there?
I think there's hesitation in our educational system today, in our classrooms, to engage in these difficult subjects. There's a lot of polarization and I think fear on how to, for teachers, and really lack of competence and confidence to address these subjects without the broader societal support. In the study that I had mentioned in my initial remarks that I did last semester with my graduate students, master's and doctoral students at Teachers College, with the funding from the Department of Homeland Security, we for the first time devised professional training for teachers who were interested in addressing intolerance and extremism in their classrooms. And one of the very frequent form of feedback that we received, or self-reflections that teachers shared, is that they lack confidence because they lack tools and training to address what they see as emerging in the United States, and really the kind of extremism and radicalized thought that is on the rise. The most recent reports from the US government, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, suggest that these far-right movements are the number one threat to the stability and democracy in the future of the United States as a very diverse country. And we really don't know how to negotiate those identities in the classroom. And this is a concept that I had discovered by doing research with radicalized groups actually in Bosnia. Bosnian Muslims are most tolerant Muslims in the world, based on Pew Research and many other studies, not only in the past, based on the past sort of history and record, but also even after genocide has been committed against us. But there are some radicalized currents inspired by Salafis. And the reason why that has occurred is because in Bosnia, we have ethnically segregated even children in the classrooms. We have schools that have two separate entrances and barbed wire that separates their curriculums, engagements, their playgrounds. And so there are children who are learning that those who committed genocide are heroes, and there are children who are learning that genocide had occurred. And so that is an extreme form of what I think is to an extent happening in the United States, where teachers lack tools and courage and societal support to engage in these conversations openly in the classroom, which then leads to various groups feeling marginalized and therefore radicalizing or engaging in various forms of violence.
Certainly fascinating, and an immediate follow-up question occurs to me. Do you feel at all, particularly with the news that's come out about Facebook in the past couple of days, and the disclosure about how they operate and influence people, kind of bringing home how widespread their influence is in terms of the information spread? Do you feel as an educator in competition sometimes with social media, and is that a problem, or is that overblown? Can we just deal with this in education systems and forget the social media, or is there kind of a back and forth battle there?
No, as I mentioned before, genocide really begins with information, with the narratives that we tell, and it can happen very quickly. It certainly happened very quickly in Bosnia, where there's only a few years of Serbia's control of the centralized media and the narrative that radicalized the vast majority of the population that was willing to kill and execute and rape on a mass scale. And I think that we would be ignorant in the United States to assume that somehow we are immune to that kind of hate emerging in the United States. And I think we see that with the rise of far-right movements. I do believe that we're not only as educators in competition with social media, but we're actually failing. We're losing that battle with social media. And one of the reasons why I have increasingly and publicly engaged over the last year, why I've written The Cat I Never Named, is to give educators a platform to discuss these issues that are current and relevant to every teen, every adult in the United States today, but do it in a context that perhaps is going to trigger less conflict in the classroom, right? Because all of these issues that I am talking about from my own experience in The Cat I Never Named are mirror images of what we should be talking about in the United States, but we are largely silent in education. So I do think that it is extremely important that we engage before it is too late, and that's one of the reasons why I think Department of Homeland Security is particularly interested in the work that I have been doing, their Center for Prevention programs, and we're going to continue. I am working this semester as well on another project with them, and we'll be working with them, I suspect, in the years to come. But I would hope that there would be more researchers. We don't have enough academics and scholars in the field of education who are actually engaging in studying the links between classroom interventions and engagement and extremism that is on the rise. Because if we don't engage, we now know various groups on Twitter and Facebook will engage those marginalized groups and deliver their narratives that will undermine the security and stability of our society.
Purely fascinating. And that brings me kind of back to your earlier comment about being educationally displaced. I think that was how you phrased it. And so being educationally displaced, if your connection is to education through social media versus education in a classroom and through well-trained teachers, that's kind of critical. What would you say, and this is the controversial question before we launch into the group chat, there's a lot being made in the media about universities, particularly elite universities today, in terms of how we're educating the youth, critical race theory, of course, being probably the thorniest issue among them. What do you think about the portrayal of educators in that way that is very current in the media at the moment versus what you are arguing for on the ground and what you're experiencing?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I could talk for hours and various thoughts and lines of thinking that I have in relation to that question. But I think sometimes we do have a problem within the elite institutions where our engagement is sort of within our own group, within the group of scholars and researchers. And a lot of research, great research that we do, is really not accessible, digestible by an average individual. For instance, 2 weeks ago, I sit on the advisory board for one of the most well-known journals on international education. And one topic that we discussed was the issue of access, where unless you have privilege of being at an elite school or great university, you might not be able to access some of the work that I do or publish in academia or somebody else. And so I do think that we need to democratize our ideas and really back them up and evoke empathy in our society. We have focused too much in some instances on on sort of statistical justification for various arguments. And I, as someone who taught statistics and probability theory during my first few years at Columbia, certainly know the value of that. But I have also realized that in my classrooms, the only way for me to really transform an individual and their mindset is to bring them into the story emotionally, to deliver a story behind the numbers and connect on a very basic human level. And I think that's where we are, where what we need to do. A couple of years ago, I had this student who often spoke in third person in the classroom about some friends that he had who had far-right views. And weeks into my course, which is titled Education, Radicalization in Islam, he came to my office hours and openly shared that he was in a way radicalized, that he had, when he walked into the classroom first, no respect for me as a Muslim scholar, but he got to know me as a human being and as an academic, and not only my work, but I do think that we lack that connection with the rest of the population, that the elite institutions have not done a great job in having our ideas being understood and accessible to vast numbers of Americans and population globally. And I believe that that's our biggest fault, and that's why we're replaced by narratives on Facebook and Twitter and other sources of social media.
It's fascinating, and I've heard similar narratives from folks in academia about kind of lamenting the death of the public intellectual, the person who is able to communicate research, statistics, high-minded research to the public in a non-condescending way, and also in a personal way with the storytelling involved. So I think that's fascinating about what you do. So I am going to jump into our Q&A here to begin this, to speak to everyone who's chatting in. Again, everyone, we have time, so please continue chatting in. So we have a comment from Raza. She says, Muslims are targeted in many countries today. Can you speak to how Muslims themselves can take action, just like Jewish people have responded after the Holocaust? Are Muslims too divided on the world stage?
First of all, Muslims are nearly 2 billion people, and religiously, certainly in the United States, most racially diverse group, which is often misunderstood in the United States, certainly. I do believe that one mode of action, from my perspective, is always education. I published in last year, in 2020, a paper that looks at essentially 1,000 years of history of how the ideas of knowledge and education evolved within Muslim communities, and something that's often misunderstood, not only by non-Muslims, but also Muslims themselves in various, particularly developing parts of the world, is that the primary message in Islam in early centuries or days during the golden age of Islam was learn and educate and seek knowledge. There's a very famous hadith, which is simply a saying of Prophet Muhammad, travel as far as China if you need to gain knowledge. It was about conquering science more so than populations. And as we know from ISIS, Boko Haram, and various extremist groups that claim that they are trying to accomplish Islamic caliphate in the name of their religion, they really don't understand that aspect of the message and the history within Islam. And I think educating ourselves individually and educating our communities doesn't only mean for Muslims to take action to engage and educate non-Muslim communities and build bridges, but also focus on self-education, a focus on gaining skill sets and expertise that really add credibility. In the Muslim world today, we don't publish that many books comparatively. Multiple countries might be publishing collectively only a fraction what a Western European country might publish in a year. And so more scholarly engagement is needed. But of course, when we look at countries like Afghanistan, that is difficult to envision, given the long history of violence, the Western colonization, involvement, conflict, and all other issues, factors that may adversely impact prospects of any one country. So for every individual, Muslim or non-Muslim, I often say, if I could educate myself and learn new things in the midst of genocide without food, light, and access to the outside world, I believe everybody can take action to self-educate, if not formally, then informally.
Yes, and I think certainly Afghanistan is the elephant in the room here, because there are so many parallels. So hopefully we'll be able to get to that. But there was something that came through in the Q&A, a question that is about that kind of nuance and the difference, not difference, but kind of the nuanced distinction, or the complicated relationship between personal storytelling and historical fact. This is a big debate contemporarily. And so he shared a quote that says, "Each one writes history according to his convenience." That comes from Jose Rizal. And so the person says, "To me personally, this quote encompasses the very reason history is such a salient topic to be taught in schools. As a freshman studying world history as part of the curriculum, I just want to know what Dr. Sabic-El-Rayess thinks about this quote, and how it highlights how we tell, interpret, and teach history and education in general, and how our implicit, explicit, and complicit biases may be reflective in this." So very complicated and important question, I think.
And I would add a brilliant, insightful question.
Yeah.
There's someone that came to mind as you were posing this question, Emily, and Christiane Amanpour, CNN journalist who was in Bosnia when the genocide was unfolding, and she was criticized to being too much of a storyteller and perhaps taking the side of Bosnian Muslims. And I think at the time she said that being objective doesn't necessarily mean being neutral. In other words, there's a clear victim and there's a clear perpetrator of violence, certainly in genocide in Bosnia. And unless that is acknowledged and processed historically, and this really applies to many other groups that have been targeted, that have been marginalized, that have been discriminated and continue to be discriminated against in the United States. I don't need to specify and mention how problematic Black racism in this country has been for a very long time. And unless those kinds of past realities are processed in the classrooms, we can't move forward, and we can't really engage in a true historic teaching of history in a way that is constructive to the future of the country. When I was growing up in former Yugoslavia, there was one version of history that I had learned from a communist perspective, but I still was able to see through those lessons that my group was excluded, that I was not represented, that the stories I heard through oral history telling within my Bosnian Muslim family of those who were executed, ethnically cleansed during the World War II, that they didn't appear as heroes or they didn't appear as victims. Nobody counted them, nobody mentioned them. And I knew the reasons why, even without being taught. And I think a lot of young children, we underestimate their power of understanding that they're not seeing themselves, and that they're seeing themselves perhaps as voiceless or misrepresented or underrepresented in our history books in particular. But I would extend that to beyond history. I think there has to be larger integration of diverse identity, particularly in the US, in education. That is the only way for us to build constructively social cohesion in our society.
That segs very neatly to a recent comment from someone who qualifies that they think the vast majority of Muslims in the world are not violent or terrorists, but speaking to television and media representations, and kind of, to me, that ties back to our earlier comment of battling with social media versus education. So this person is wondering about the disproportionate representation of Muslims in the media currently. And I think the implicit question there is, okay, again, back to education, how do you, in competition with that, counterbalance that representation or misrepresentation?
Because of the explicit and implicit biases that exist in education, that exist in various industries, it is very difficult for someone who's Muslim to really achieve a professional social mobility, if you will, in terms of careers. And I think that manifests. I've experienced anti-Muslim bias and anti-Muslim discrimination, and the first question that I'm always asked by someone who meets me and finds out that I'm Muslim, but you can't be because you don't look like one. And my question often is, what does a Muslim look like? So encountering that every step of the way makes it very difficult and requires both persistence and resilience for one to keep working hard and believing that they can make a difference and be part of those who sort of break glass ceilings and enter those spaces, particularly in media. I do think that there are some improvements, and I do think that Black Lives Matter movement made a significant difference and impact in the United States. I don't think we've solved all the problems, but I do think that it has brought about awareness of the lack of representation, for instance, of those who might report stories in the media and how they tell those narratives in general and that come from a minority or racialized groups. But in terms of representation of Muslims, it's something that I deal with, I would say, on a regular basis in my daily life as an individual. And many of my students who are at Columbia might struggle with similar identity issues and bring them up in the classrooms, particularly if they have Muslim backgrounds. And I go back to an answer that I gave to someone who asked the question, what can we do as Muslims? My answer to that question was, we have to focus individually on what each one of us can do to really break those stereotypes that exist and become part of those who are telling the narratives. That's one of the reasons I wrote The Cat I Never Named, because I read so much that has been written and told about Bosnia by others, but I felt it was time, and I was ready, emotionally ready, to tell my story. It was time to hear my voice and share my voice with others who wanted to learn about Bosnia.
That's wonderful. So I'm going to move to Robert, who thanks you for a moving presentation. I thank you too. He says it brought back memories of his childhood growing up in the war in Lebanon in the mid-70s, in the shadows of bombs, missiles, kidnappings, disappearances, extrajudicial killings, etc. Goodness. He adds that there are echoes in this with the war in Northern Ireland and more recently Syria. I would add Afghanistan, of course. He says the fault lines in all of these countries are different, but the hate looks and sounds eerily familiar. Otherness, the need to dehumanize, then kill the other seems to be the same in all of these conflicts. So that gets back to my framing remarks at the beginning of this being both timely and timeless at the same time. So what are your thoughts on kind of how same old, and yet maybe we might move ahead in this specific context?
You know, I'm an optimist. First of all, I'm sorry for what you experienced in Lebanon, who posed that question. I am truly an optimist. I think giving up is not an option, and I do think that a vast majority, just looking at reactions of people who have read my book, vast majority of people are curious and simply need to be educated. And that is where I believe we have failed over and over again. I've gotten hundreds of letters from individuals who are parents. This is a young adult book, and some parents would write, and this is sort of a typical reflection that I would hear. Parents would write, my teenage daughter brought your story, your book home. It's assigned for her classroom. I wasn't sure I wanted her to read about a Muslim girl. And I apologize for thinking that way, because I took the book to read it with the expectation I would tell my child that she can't read it or shouldn't read it or complain to a teacher. And here I am. It's 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and I couldn't put it down. I read the book and I learned so much, not only about your story, but about myself and my own biases. And so I do really find that vast majority of people I interact with, whether it is in the classroom, whether it is in foreign contexts. I've been in more than 30 countries and have engaged in about 200 of these types of conversations over the last year or so. I have rarely been attacked for my identity. It did happen once at the university in Austria. I do get occasional threats and letters from various people with very racist perspectives. But I would say 99% of people are willing to learn as long as we're willing to engage them. And I think that engagement part is the part or the piece that we haven't figured out in our educational system quite yet.
I want to come back to that because I'm fascinated by that too, as an academic and educator. Lots of comments, Amra, just to validate you, just thanking you for sharing your powerful story. One question that you and I both predicted would come up again was the differentiation between indoctrination and education, and if you can speak to that. Obviously, the reference is probably critical race theory, but also more broadly, thoughts about how universities are conducting their educational programs, and kind of the dividing line between informing, illuminating, giving folks critical thinking tools, and when are you creating robots who, are programmed with what you're teaching them.
Mm-hmm. You know, this makes me think of a moment when I came first in the United States and when I realized the difference between indoctrination and critical thinking. I would say I certainly engaged in critical thinking in being a very dedicated math student growing up in former Yugoslavia. But I had my first economics exam, and Emily, you might remember George Boards was an older professor. He was teaching, I think, Economics 101 or one of these large classes, and coming from a system that indoctrinated me, I came in quite literally memorizing whatever chapters we were supposed to cover for this particular exam he was giving that day, test that we had. And I had 5 pencils sharpened. I was ready to go. I thought I was going to get the great great because I memorized everything. I knew every problem, could solve it fast, and I had all this confidence. And then he posed one question. He said, what would be your position on whether we should have a market for kidneys as human organ, and argue either in favor of having the market or against, and use the principles in economics and various arguments that we have covered in the class. And that was the first moment in my life when I realized that I never really was part of the educational experience in the way that I should have been growing up. And that's the moment when I was sort of under pressure for the first time, engaged in truly critical thinking and delivering my own opinion, my own perspective. So in terms of, that banking model of education where I deliver the content and the students just memorize, it's certainly something that I don't engage in because it's not effective, it has no purpose, and it is not what our students are looking for. One of the reasons why I engaged my students last semester on this project with the Department of Homeland Security that I had mentioned is because I felt that they were lost in this pandemic, and they felt that many of them were asking, what is the purpose of getting a degree, even if it is at Columbia, aside from having a stamp of approval from an elite institution? What am I really doing here? And what is the purpose if this world is falling apart? And so I took out typical exams that I had in that course, and I said, we're going to do something new. You are going to innovate. I will teach you the theories. I will give you diverse authors. So for me, it's very important to not only include publications from US authors or British authors or Western European authors, but also include perspectives from authors that are from the developing world that might think differently and view things differently. And I would say that of all of the classes I've ever taught, in the pandemic, these courses with the full, complete engagement of students where they were tested on their leadership and their engagement and their critical thinking were most empowering for me, but also for them. I had students in last lesson of last semester break down and cry and say, I've never experienced this sense of confidence that I built this semester because I built something. I found the solution to a problem that we're all facing. And so that's what I hope we, after this pandemic, not only COVID-19 pandemic, but I think also sort of pandemic of hate that we have seen in the last few years, that we really stop and think for a second about what should education look like in years to come, given all of these factors and challenges we're facing, and how should we be educating young generations for a future that many of us doubt now can be stable or safe or peaceful if we continue in this direction.
I think it's fascinating, something that you said a bit earlier on in that indoctrination is not what students want. It is sticking in my mind because that's so counter to the narrative that's presented in social media about students not wanting dissension, not wanting to think for themselves. So saying that critical thinking is actually, in your experience on the ground, what students want is very powerful and encouraging. So thank you for that good news. We have a question from Victoria that asks, what are some of the books or other readings that you have encountered that have moved or made a strong impression on you?
You know, there's a book that I assigned in this course that I'm teaching this semester by Ed Hussein, the Islamist. And that really links to remarks I made a few minutes ago, that it's very important to diversify perspectives that we bring into American classrooms. And I always tell my students that I expect you to critically think, because something is published, it doesn't mean that it is factual or that it is great or that that is perspective I share. I want you to be able to judge and opine and evaluate everything that I put into your hands. But it's really important to build that skill by giving diverse perspectives to students. And Ed Hussein's book, The Islamist, is actually chronicling his own story. He's a British Muslim. He was comes from a immigrant background, and he tells the story of how he grew up and radicalized over the years. And in that book, in fact, notes that Bosnia was one of the reasons why, even though he was completely physically detached, he was not ideologically or emotionally detached from the genocide in Bosnia when he was being radicalized. And that was one of the reasons why he joined an extremist group and then de-radicalized. And so I think always books that tell personal stories of people who have gone through transformational moments are incredibly important, because they give us insights where the individual going through transformation is sharing their perspective. We tend to objectify othered groups. We tend to study othered groups. We tend to have this sense of privilege, particularly in the academia in the United States, to in some ways look down upon othered groups because we have solutions. We know what the solutions are. And so I like to break that up by giving personal accounts from people who may have had transformational experiences that will be very insightful for the students. So that's the book I would recommend.
That's lovely. And it also makes me wonder, is that kind of in line with why you also choose to write for both adult and young adult audiences, in terms of kind of widening your sense of whom you're engaging and whom you're speaking to, not just a rarefied group?
That's correct. That's correct. And the ideas that I present in The Cat I Never Named are the ideas that I might be writing in my academic papers that a 12-year-old or 15-year-old or 22-year-old in the United States who is not interested in those subjects might never hear about. But they get to hear about it through my own experience in The Cat I Never Named. So that was certainly a driving factor. And I have to say, I also have to give credit to my younger daughter, who was in third grade at the time. And this was when Donald Trump was running for office, and she came home from school. We live in New York City. She came home from school one day and she asked me, "Mom, what will happen to me and Jana?" And Jana is her older sister, "if you and Dad are rounded up as Muslims?" And that was the moment when I realized I really haven't been successful in protecting my own children from being exposed to the hate and the kind of hate that I had experienced growing up. And that was one of the really triggers for me to sit down and write the story and realizations that young people are processing these hateful narratives on their own, and they need to be given a tool to process them more effectively, and perhaps a role model that might inspire their resilience. Because many young, I'm thinking about young teens in Afghanistan right now, have a lot of reasons to radicalize. Exposure to violence is one of the primary risk factors for radicalization. But how does one process being an object of hate or being hurt through violence and not respond with violence? And that's what my book hopes to teach in a very, very accessible way.
Beautiful. And a new comment came in that makes me think of our DC specific audience and the public humanities in particular, because there's, in that space, in addition to academia, a very thorny line between rah-rah happy, uniform narratives of a country's history or any history in general, and more nuanced, complicated ones like you're trying to tell. So their question is, what is the role of complexity and flexibility in this space? For example, can we embrace, be proud of, and build on imperfect history and the present? How do we mesh with people who have cognitively simpler styles and want clear rules and unblemished heroes? And I say DC audience in particular, thinking about controversies that the Smithsonian, for example, has encountered in the narratives that they've tried to tell that are more complicated than pure heroism and like simple, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. So again, where's the role for complexity and nuance in these sorts of educational endeavors?
I think all of these questions have been brilliant, and it's just another brilliant question. I think complexity is necessary and nuance is necessary in all of these stories. Just as an example, even in The Cat I Never Named, I have a few moments where I explore, well, should I hate back? And I think I didn't want to create this story where I withhold that side of anger that is natural and expected in extreme circumstance. Should I hurt someone back because everyone I love is being hurt, raped, killed, and injured? And at the same time, I bring in the characters who were the real characters in my life who made the difference, from an incredible cat that saved my life a few times to my parents, my mom, who's an educator herself, and my father, who's a World War II orphan, and whose father died fighting Nazis. And he was particularly critical in kind of shaping my own personal history and making sure that I stay on the right path. So I think simplifying a role that we've done wonderful things around the world, yet we're invading other countries and causing death and casualties is not going to be helpful to our standing in the world, nor is it true. Even in, as an example, in Bosnia, United States and NATO did not intervene when genocide in Srebrenica was occurring. It was occurring in July, and I distinctly remember when the weather was used as an excuse for not intervening in Bosnia in the middle of the summer when the weather was beautiful. Intervention only came in August after the Bosnian army broke the siege in my city, broke the Serb siege, and we started to advance into other parts of Bosnia. And I think at that moment there was a concern in Europe, what would now Bosnian Muslims do to Serbs in response to genocide, and would there be more bloodshed? And could we possibly have a Muslim state in Europe? I think these are all honest concerns, I think, that should be recognized, that were underlining policy decisions and actions of the West in Bosnia, that the people who were the victims were Muslims, and there was some level of othering in that process. And not engaging in that discussion and learning from that experience, or not engaging honestly with the Afghanistan failure. We didn't only fail in Afghanistan, we increased radicalization in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was 16th on the global terrorism index a year before we invaded Afghanistan, and now it is number one. We have left immense weapons. We have impacted the country and through various airstrikes killed thousands of innocent people. And to expect that won't impact these vulnerable populations that have been persecuted or attacked or occupied by Western powers for centuries, I think is way too simplistic. And so I do believe that we really need to engage in complex conversations, and for as long as we evade them, we're not gonna do better in the world or at home.
Well said. Want to note, because we are closing towards the end of this, we have just 10 minutes left, about someone has asked if we can share a list of references, and I certainly think that's possible. Amra, you and I and the team can.
Absolutely.
Something. You've shared so much of yourself and your ideas, but also want to give you a moment to have closing remarks, if you will, and kind of share what you want to at the end.
You know, my hope is, first of all, I want to share that it's always difficult for me to have these conversations. It took many years. People often ask me, why did I write The Cat I Never Named Now? And as I shared, it was really triggered by concern for my own children in the United States of America as Muslims. But more than that, it is not easy to be a target of violence and hate, and then expose yourself, you know, in the most vulnerable way, emotionally, to the world. But I do, again, want to reiterate the point that I made before, and that is that I have been so deeply touched by welcoming and desire to learn or hear more or engage, or letters I've received from people after engaging in conversations like this, that it really does give me hope that we can make a difference. If I lost that hope, I wouldn't be where I am today. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, not only with my students, but in terms of engaging the public. And so I just really want to say that I'm grateful to everyone who showed up tonight on Zoom. We're all tired from Zoom and from this pandemic, but you made the choice to be here and be part of this conversation, which is something that I incredibly appreciate, particularly if you didn't have those kinds of experiences that I've had, or you haven't been targeted for one reason or another. I commend you for having that courage and having that curiosity. And I do hope that everyone who is with us tonight goes out in the world and is a bit nicer or kinder to everyone that they encounter in life. I think that makes a huge difference. And starting from there, and building up to hiring people in the workplace that might have different backgrounds and identities than your own, to mentoring young people who are looking for a role model. I am helping, I do so many different things, but my doorman in New York City has asked me if I would give his daughter advice, who's a great student, and he doesn't know anything. He has an immigrant background, doesn't know anything about elite schools in New York City, and apparently she's an exceptional student, but he doesn't know how to apply. So I will help that young child. Those kinds of acts might seem insignificant, but they can change someone's life. There were strangers in my life who helped me along the way. And my hope is that I continue to pay it forward. And my hope is that you join me in being someone who will fight those kinds of tendencies to other and hate that we're seeing in our society.
Well, at the close of a somewhat intense conversation, that's such an optimistic message. Thank you so much for that, and for your time and your ideas. So for everyone watching, I will echo Amra in thanking you for making time to listen and share your thoughts and questions. The recording will be available within 24 hours, and we will work on sharing the resources that were touched on today in terms of recommendations. But thank you all, and thank you, Amra.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye. Thank you, Emily.
Bye-bye.